What if I told you an 18-year-old kid from Missouri built a Pontiac engine for $70 that humiliated factory race cars worth thousands? This isn't some tall tale from a dusty garage. This is the story of how Arnie Beswick outsmarted General Motors' finest engineers with nothing but junkyard parts and teenage audacity. Picture this. It's 1964 at a Midwest drag strip. The air is thick with tire smoke and high-octane fumes. A line of Pontiac 421 Super Duty cars sits in the staging lanes, factory-built race machines with price tags that could buy a house. These are the kings of the quarter mile, packed with exotic parts most people have never even seen. Then this kid rolls up in a beat-up Tempest with mismatched body panels and primer spots. The veterans laugh. They stop laughing when his time slip shows 11:90 seconds. This is the story of the 389 Tri-Power that shouldn't have existed, an engine combination that proved everything Pontiac was telling customers about needing the big 421 was wrong. Arnie Beswick didn't just build a fast car, he exposed a truth the factory didn't want racers to know. To understand why this matters, we need to travel back to 1964 Pontiac. The division was riding high on performance reputation. They had John DeLorean running engineering, guys like Jim Wangers handling marketing, and a NASCAR championship under their belt. The GTO had just launched, creating the muscle car market overnight. Pontiac was the excitement division of General Motors, and they had two distinct paths to power. Then first was the 389 cubic inch V8. This was Pontiac's workhorse, the engine in everything from grocery getter Catalinas to the new GTO. It made decent power, around 325 to 348 horsepower in tri-power form, and cost reasonable money. The 389 used a 4.06-inch bore and 3.75-inch stroke, pretty standard dimensions for the era. Compression ratios ranged from 10.25:1 to 10.75:1, depending on application. Good engine, solid performer, nothing exotic. Then there was the 421 Super Duty. This was Pontiac's nuclear option. Bore went up to 4.09 inches, stroke stretched to 4.0 inches, giving 421 cubic inches of displacement. But the Super Duty wasn't just bigger, it was built with exotic components. We're talking about forged aluminum pistons, forged steel connecting rods, a forged steel crankshaft, and special McKellar camshafts ground specifically for drag racing. The heads were completely different castings with larger valves and ports. These engines cost over $2,000 in 1964. Money. That's about $20,000 today. Nenich and the 421 Super Duty made 370 horsepower on paper, but everyone knew that was conservative. Real output was closer to 460 horsepower. These engines powered the Swiss cheese Catalinas, the lightweight specials that dominated super stock drag racing. A 421 Super Duty Catalina could run low 12s or high 11s straight from the factory. They were virtually unbeatable in their class. Engineer Pontiac's message was clear. You want to go fast? You need displacement. You need the 421. The 389 was fine for street cars, but serious racers needed serious cubic inches. This wasn't just marketing, it was engineering gospel. Pontiac engineers genuinely believed the 421's larger displacement and exotic components were necessary for maximum performance. Once discharged, Nenter, Arnie Beswick, 18 years old, working at a machine shop in Missouri for $2 an hour. Beswick had been around engines his whole life. His dad was a mechanic, and Arnie had been turning wrenches since he could hold them. But he didn't have 421 Super Duty money. Hell, he barely had gas money. And what Beswick did have was access to a machine shop after hours and a theory about why Pontiacs made power. He'd been studying the 421 Super Duty engines when they came through for service. He noticed something interesting. The biggest difference between the 389 and 421 wasn't the displacement. It was the cylinder heads and induction system. In addition, the 421 Super Duty heads had larger intake ports, bigger valves, and better flow characteristics. The tri-power induction, 3 two-barrel carburetors on a special intake manifold, was calibrated specifically for the 421's breathing requirements. Beswick wondered, what if you could make a 389 breathe like a 421? So Beswick went hunting. He found a 389 block at a junkyard, pulled from a wrecked 1963 Catalina, $40. The engine had a spun bearing, but the block was good. He grabbed the heads too, even though one had a crack between the valve seats. Then he got lucky, really lucky. A local racer was parting out a wrecked GTO and had a complete tri-power setup, $30 and $70 total. That's what Beswick had invested when he started the build that would shake up Midwest drag racing. The machine work was where Beswick's day job paid off. After hours, with the shop owner's permission, he went to work. First, the block. He bored it .030 over, taking it from 389 to 396 cubic inches. Not a huge gain, but every bit helped. He align-honed the main bearings, making sure the crankshaft would spin true. The stock cast crank was fine. Beswick couldn't afford forged steel anyway. The heads were where the magic happened. Beswick spent 3 weeks with a die grinder opening up the intake ports. He studied airflow, understanding that velocity mattered as much as volume. The ports couldn't just be bigger, they had to be the right shape. He blended the bowl areas under the valve seats, removing casting irregularities that disrupted flow. He opened up the exhaust ports too, but not as much. Exhaust flow wasn't as critical as intake flow for making power. The combustion chambers got attention next. Beswick polished them to a mirror finish, reducing hot spots that could cause detonation. He milled the heads .040 inches, reducing combustion chamber volume. Combined with flat-top pistons, this gave him 11.1 compression. That was aggressive for pump gas, but Missouri had access to Sunoco 260, which was rated at 104 octane, and the valve job was critical. Beswick cut the seats at multiple angles, 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and 60 degrees on the intakes. This created a better flow path as the valve opened. He used stock 389 valve sizes, 1.96-inch intakes, and 1.60-inch exhausts. The 421 Super Duty had 2.02-inch intakes and 1.76-inch exhausts, but Beswick couldn't afford them. Besides, his theory was that properly shaped ports mattered more than valve size. The tri-power setup needed work too. These were 3 Rochester 2GC 2-barrel carburetors on an aluminum intake manifold. The center carburetor provided primary throttle response and idle. The 2 outboard carburetors were vacuum-operated secondaries that opened under heavy acceleration. Total airflow was about 960 cubic feet per minute, plenty for a 389 Spot-Nenen-Meas, but the calibration was wrong for Beswick's application. The jets were too small, designed for a mild 389 with 10.51 compression. Beswick went up 3 jet sizes on all 3 carburetors. He modified the power valves to open earlier, enriching the mixture sooner. He recurved the vacuum advance on the distributor, bringing in timing faster. Total timing went from 32 degrees to 38 degrees, right on the edge of detonation. The camshaft choice was interesting. Beswick couldn't afford a roller cam like the Super Duty engines used. He found a used McKellar .10 hydraulic cam from a racer who was upgrading. This cam had .470-inch lift and 288 degrees of advertised duration. Not as aggressive as the Super Duty's roller, but plenty healthy for a hydraulic cam. The overlap was significant, giving that choppy idle that screamed performance. For the exhaust, Beswick fabricated headers from scratch. He couldn't afford Hooker or Jardine headers, so he bought J-bends from the local speed shop and welded them himself. The primary tubes were 1.75 inches in diameter, stepping up to a 3-inch collector. Not pretty, but functional. The collectors dumped into straight pipes with no mufflers. Subtle wasn't part of the program. The transmission was a close ratio 4-speed from a wrecked GTO. The rear axle was a standard Pontiac 8.2-inch with 4.11.1 gears. Nothing exotic, just good parts matched properly. In the end, when Beswick fired up the 389 for the first time, it sounded angry. The big cam and straight pipes created a bark that rattled windows. But the real test would come at the drag strip. Emulon Dragway, September 1964. Beswick's Tempest looked rough. He'd focused on the mechanicals, not the cosmetics. Primer gray with some rust showing through, mismatched wheels, and those homemade headers poking out beneath the doors. The tech inspectors almost laughed him off the property until they heard it run. And then first pass, 12.24 seconds at 112 miles per hour. Not bad, but Beswick knew there was more. He leaned out the center carburetor slightly, added 2 degrees of timing. Second pass, 12.8 at 114. Getting better. Then the 421 Super Duty cars started showing up. These were the heavy hitters, the cars that dominated Superstock and AFX classes. Swiss cheese Catalinas with aluminum front ends, plexiglass windows, and those exotic 421 Super Duty engines. They expected to run unopposed, setting records and taking home trophies. Enershan and Beswick watched them run. Most were in the low 12s, with one exceptional Catalina running 11.95. That was the number to beat. Beswick made one more adjustment, advancing his timing another degree. Dangerous territory, but he could hear from the exhaust note that the engine wanted it. His next pass changed everything. 11.90 seconds at 116 miles per hour. The Super Duty guys couldn't believe it. This kid in a primer gray heap had just outrun factory race cars. They demanded to see under the hood. When Beswick popped it open, they saw a 389. A worked-over, carefully tuned 389, but still just a 389, one word, spread quickly through Missouri racing circles. Beswick started getting challenged at every event. Super Duty owners wanted to prove their expensive engines were superior. Most times, they lost. Beswick's Tempest was consistently running 11.90s, occasionally dipping into the 1180s when conditions were right. How was this possible? How could a $70 junkyard build outrun engines that cost thousands? The answer lay in understanding what actually makes power. Displacement is just one factor. An engine is an air pump. The more air you can move through it efficiently, the more power it makes. The 421 Super Duty had 32 more cubic inches than the 389, about 8% more displacement. But Beswick's headwork had improved airflow by nearly 15% over stock 389 heads. Think about it this way. The 421 was like having a bigger bucket to carry water, but the 389 with better heads was like having a slightly smaller bucket with a much bigger faucet filling it. The flow rate mattered more than the container size. The tri-power setup was crucial too. Those 3 carburetors, when properly tuned, delivered a perfect air-fuel mixture across the entire RPM range. The progressive opening of the outboard carburetors matched the engine's breathing requirements exactly. As RPM climbed and the engine needed more air, the secondaries opened to provide it. But here's what really made Beswick's build special. He understood the relationship between all the components. The cam timing had to match the head flow characteristics. The ignition curve had to match the compression ratio and fuel octane. The carburetor calibration had to match the cam overlap and exhaust scavenging. Everything worked together. The 421 Super Duty engines were built with exotic components because Pontiac engineers assumed you needed forged internals to handle high RPM and compression. They were built for durability in professional racing. Beswick's 389 didn't need to last a full season of superstock racing. It just needed to make power for 13 seconds at a time. This is where corporate engineering met grassroots innovation. Pontiac's engineers weren't wrong. The 421 Super Duty was an incredible engine. But they were solving a different problem. They needed an engine that could be sold to racers with a warranty, that could survive abuse, that would be consistent and reliable. Beswick just needed to go fast, once, right now. The implications of Beswick's success rippled through the Pontiac performance community. If a kid could make a 389 run with the 421s, what else was possible? Racers started experimenting with head porting, cam timing, and carburation instead of just throwing displacement at the problem. Arnie Pontiac noticed too. Within a year, they released the 389 Tri-Power with better flowing heads as a regular production option. The 1965 GTO's top engine made 360 horsepower with Tri-Power, up from 348 the previous year. The heads had larger ports, similar to what Beswick had created with his die grinder. Coincidence? Unlikely. Tense time. But the real revolution was in thinking. Beswick proved that intelligent modification could overcome displacement disadvantage. This philosophy would drive the entire pro-stock movement in drag racing. By the late 1960s, everyone was porting heads, adjusting cam timing, and fine-tuning induction systems. The days of just bolting on parts and hoping for the best were over. Let's talk about what Beswick's 389 actually did on that track. 11.9 seconds doesn't sound fast by today's standards. Modern Challengers and Mustangs run that straight from the showroom. But in 1964, breaking into the 11s was exotic territory. Professional drag racers with unlimited budgets struggled to run 11s consistently. The physics involved are staggering. To accelerate a 3,400-pound car to 116 miles per hour in under 12 seconds requires enormous force. The 389 was producing about 450 horsepower at the flywheel. We know this from later dyno testing of similar combinations. That's 1.15 horsepower per cubic inch, exceptional for 1964 technology. And at launch, the Tempest was pulling about 1.2 Gs of acceleration. The tires were barely adequate, bias ply M&H slicks that were maybe 8 inches wide. Traction was marginal. Beswick had to feather the clutch perfectly, bringing in power gradually to avoid overwhelming the tires. Too aggressive, and he'd smoke them. Too soft, and he'd lose precious tenths. The 4-speed transmission was crucial. Beswick could keep the engine in its power band, shifting at exactly 6,200 RPM where power peaked. The close ratios meant he never fell out of the cam's operating range. First gear got him to 45 miles per hour, second to 70, third to 95, and he'd just touch fourth before the finish line. Now the aerodynamics were terrible. The Tempest's boxy shape created enormous drag at speed. Above 100 miles per hour, half the engine's power was just fighting air resistance. Modern cars with better aerodynamics would be significantly faster with the same power. But none of that mattered to the guys Beswick was beating. They had the same aerodynamic challenges, better tires, and supposedly superior engines. Yet this kid kept winning. And the psychological impact was significant. Imagine spending $2,000 on a Super Duty engine, plus another $1,000 on aluminum body parts and chassis modifications. You're running a factory-backed combination that's supposed to be unbeatable. Then you lose to a teenager in a $70 junkyard special. It must have been crushing. And some accused Beswick of cheating. They demanded teardowns, claiming he must have a stroker crank or nitrous oxide. Every time, the tech inspectors found the same thing, a 396 cubic inch Pontiac with ported heads and Tri-Power, legal as could be. The grudge races started getting serious. Money was changing hands, $100 bills that meant the difference between eating that month or not. Beswick kept winning. His reputation spread beyond Missouri. Racers from Illinois, Kansas, and Arkansas started showing up to challenge the kid with the magic 389. Pontiac. Beswick's approach to racing was methodical. He kept detailed notes about every pass, weather conditions, track temperature, barometric pressure, humidity. He adjusted his tune-up for each variable. On cold days, he'd lean out the carburetors slightly. On humid days, he'd retard the timing a degree. This attention to detail gave him consistency that his opponents lacked. The engine held together remarkably well considering its humble origins. The stock cast pistons and connecting rods survived repeated 6,200 RPM shifts. The cracked cylinder head never failed completely, though Beswick had to add stop leak to the cooling system occasionally. The bottom end stayed intact for an entire season of racing. NHNBI winter of 1964, Beswick had won enough money to consider upgrading, but he didn't build a 421. Instead, he took his 389 formula and refined it. Better pistons, roller rockers, a slightly bigger cam. The following year, his 389 ran 11.75, even faster than before. Now, the legacy of Beswick's build extends far beyond those Missouri drag strips. He proved a fundamental truth about hot rodding: knowledge beats money. Understanding how engines actually make power is more valuable than having the biggest checkbook. Tens nos. This philosophy influenced an entire generation of racers. Guys like Grumpy Jenkins, Sox and Martin, and Dick Landy all adopted similar approaches. They focused on airflow, combination tuning, and detail work rather than just displacement and exotic parts. The pro stock class that emerged in 1970 was built on principles Beswick demonstrated in 1964, and Pontiac's engine development shifted too. The 1967 400 cubic inch engine that replaced the 389 came with better flowing heads from the factory. The Ram Air engines of 1968-1970 featured carefully tuned induction systems that maximized airflow. The engineers had learned what that Missouri kid knew all along: breathing matters more than bore size. The tri-power setup became legendary partly because of builds like Beswick's. Today, a complete original tri-power system sells for $5,000 or more. Reproduction systems cost $2,000. That $30 setup Beswick bought would be worth a fortune now. But the real value wasn't monetary. Beswick's 389 represented something bigger: the democratic nature of American hot rodding. You didn't need to be rich or connected to go fast. You needed to understand engines, work hard, and think creatively. A kid with $70 could humble the factory teams if he was smart enough. Non-modern engine builders still use Beswick's principles. Today's LS and Coyote engines make enormous power not through displacement, but through superior head design and induction systems. A modern 5.3-liter LS engine with ported heads can easily make 500 horsepower, about 1.5 horsepower per cubic inch. That's the evolution of what Beswick started. The specific techniques have evolved. CNC porting machines do in hours what took Beswick weeks with a die grinder. Computer modeling predicts airflow patterns that Beswick had to discover through trial and error. Electronic fuel injection delivers perfect mixture ratios that carburetors could only approximate. But the fundamental approach remains unchanged. Identify the restriction, remove it. Understand the relationship between components. Test, adjust, improve. Don't accept conventional wisdom without questioning it. Arnie Beswick went on to have a successful racing career, eventually getting sponsorship and better equipment. But he never forgot that first 389. In interviews decades later, he still called it his favorite engine. Not because it was the fastest he ever built, but because it taught him, and everyone else, what was really possible. The Tempest itself survived until 1968, when Beswick finally retired it after a crash at Milan Dragway. The engine was salvaged and went into another racer's car. Parts of it might still be out there, mixed into other builds, continuing to make power 50 years later. And the 389 tri-power combination became one of the most sought-after Pontiac performance packages. The 1964-1966 GTO tri-power cars are now worth six figures in restored condition. Collectors prize them for their historical significance and genuine performance. Every one of them owes something to that kid in Missouri who proved what the combination could really do. And then think about what Beswick really accomplished. He didn't just build a fast engine. He changed how people thought about building fast engines. He proved that corporate engineering could be beaten by individual innovation. He showed that understanding principles mattered more than following formulas. In many ways, Beswick's story is the story of American hot rodding itself. Take what you have, make it better, prove the experts wrong. Don't accept limitations, question everything. If something seems impossible, try it anyway. You might just revolutionize an entire industry with $70 and some ambition. And today's enthusiasts have forgotten how revolutionary Beswick's approach was. We take for granted that cylinder head porting works, that cam timing matters, that careful tuning beats brute force. But in 1964, these weren't accepted facts. They were theories that a teenager proved with a die grinder and determination. The next time someone tells you that you need the biggest, most expensive engine to go fast, remember Arnie Beswick. Remember that Missouri kid who took a $70 junkyard 389 and embarrassed the factory Super Duty cars. Remember that knowledge, creativity, and hard work can overcome any disadvantage. And that's the real lesson of the 389 Tri-Power. Not just that it made power, but that it proved power could be made by anyone willing to learn how. The democratization of speed, proven 1/4 mile at a time. What's the most impressive underdog build you've ever seen dominate expensive factory equipment? Drop a comment below and share your own David versus Goliath story. And if you enjoyed learning how a teenager outsmarted General Motors with junkyard parts, hit that subscribe button for more legendary engine stories that changed racing history. Until next time, keep those engines screaming.